Okay, and so we've had a couple mentions now of government, and our last speaker, Celia Gould, is the director of Idaho State Department of Agriculture, which he's been doing for the last 11 years, has been on 25 international trade missions, but is also an owner-operator of a fourth-generation farming and ranching operation in Idaho. Thanks. Have a warm welcome for Celia.
Okay. Thank you, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here today. I have to say it was fairly intimidating and daunting when Dr. Johansson called and asked about this summit. As a matter of fact, when I told my son that I was going to be speaking along such a distinguished group of panelists, he said to me, "Mom, isn't that a bit like taking a butter knife to a gunfight?" But the more we thought about it, the more it seemed like a good fit. The Idaho Department of Agriculture sits at the nexus of regulation, policy, production, and people. I've also had the privilege of serving the state of Idaho for 27 years, first in our state house and now as the director of an agency. Now, I'm no economist. And we borrowed data heavily from our land-grant university, the great people at NASS, and our industry. But we do have some compelling stories coming out of Idaho. But first, let's take a look at a snapshot of Idaho agriculture. Here's what agriculture looks like in Idaho. It generates 20% of all sales in the state. That's more than any other single sector. It also accounts for 14% of our jobs and is 16% of our gross domestic product. And you cannot overestimate what agriculture means for Idaho. It's the base of our economy, but it's also the cornerstone of our culture. As most of you may know, Idaho is an arid state, heavily dependent on irrigation. We are also diverse. We produce 180 commodities, but we are strongly dominated by dairy and beef. In fact, livestock accounts for more than half of our total agri-receipts. Idaho agriculture and food processing together total $16 billion in receipts. And here's something critical. Agriculture is still respected in Idaho, in our communities, and in our capital. We have a small population with big ag impact. As you see on this slide, we are number 4 in the nation for how much of our farm GDP contributes to the state's overall GDP. This data is from 2015, but we believe it still holds true even given what you'll see in my next slide. Now I want to turn to look at a specific ag sector in Idaho. Last year Idaho hit another milestone. We are the fastest growing state in the nation with greater than 2% growth last year. That provides for opportunities, but also challenges. Now I want to turn to look at a specific ag sector in Idaho. As you know, we are famous for our beloved potatoes. In fact, I bet you thought this old gal from Idaho would talk about nothing but potatoes. But really, it's dairy that reigns supreme in Idaho in terms of cash receipts. And I think dairy is important to talk about today because it has such significance in terms of national policy, our next farm bill, and economic opportunity. You may not realize this, but Idaho is the 4th largest dairy state in the US. We are usually neck and neck with New York and can sit at number 3 depending on the year. Dairy is hugely important to our economy. It makes up more than 1/3 of our total ag receipts and is our top export. When you look at cash receipts plus additional dollars generated by the sector, Idaho's dairy total economic impact is $10.4 billion. That's a lot for a state with a small population. So despite our sometimes lower prices, dairy overall is doing well in Idaho, but what do the numbers show? Well, as the graph demonstrates, as the graph would show if I had the right one up there. Here we go. As the graph demonstrates, our dairymen shine in terms of production. In just 16 years, Idaho's dairymen have doubled production. If you look back even further, you can see that the production has tripled in roughly 30 years. More importantly, though, the trend line is steady. And that says a lot about the state of our dairy industry. Now let's look at another piece of information. Other states may produce more volume than Idaho, but our dairymen are getting the most of their resources. Idaho's per head production rate exceeds competing states and far exceeds the national average. In fact, if you looked at Idaho cows in just one day, they outproduced the national per head average by 3 million pounds every day last year. We've looked at production, but let's also look at some other factors that make Idaho's dairy sector unique. Now, these comments are not intended to ruffle feathers with other states, nor am I suggesting that our way is better than another. I just want to offer some insight into what makes our dairy situation unique. As a big dairy state, we often get called for perspective when a national dairy crisis hits. When I first started at the agency, I would get the call, and then I'd call our dairymen and ask how I should respond or how I could help, and they would politely say, "Celia, just stay out of it." At first, I just assumed that was because I was a beef producer and they thought I knew nothing but beef cattle. But in time, I learned it's because the dairy industry in Idaho is just different than most states. And I think that's part of the importance of having a state perspective on a panel like this. States can still be laboratories for policy and production differences. As you see on this slide, Idaho is not part of the federal milk marketing order. That means our milk prices are competitive at around 55 cents lower than the US all milk price. At $15 to $16 per hundredweight, our break-even costs are also estimated to be lower than other large dairy states. That gives leeway to producers and processors to contract based on market conditions rather than a regulatory paradigm. And lastly, there's our location quotient, which we're going to see more in the next slide. Looking more closely now at location quotient, I want to call attention specifically to South Central Idaho. This is our processing epicenter. Thanks to a major processing boom, this area is now one of the top paying and highest density food processing areas in the US. Here's another way of looking at the information. You can see how people, production, processing, and transportation in Idaho coalesce. This confluence of factors isn't rocket science, but not all states are so blessed to have the pieces come together this cohesively. Now, how does Idaho make the most of this recipe? Well, frankly, sometimes government just simply needs to get out of the way. But we also have to know when to come together cohesively and effectively. This is what we at home call Team Idaho. It's a vision seen by our governor and agency leaders where we move at the speed of business. We collaborate on everything from inspections to promotions. We work with companies to address regulatory hurdles. And as you see on this slide, our task force includes agencies responsible for agriculture, commerce, labor, environmental regulation, and transportation. We also work very closely with county and city governments on specific projects in their areas. And we have seen major success from this approach. Idaho's Magic Valley in south central Idaho has been home to astounding growth in food processing. It has been the epicenter of ag production for years and now is home to a processing boom. A few years ago, Chobani chose the Magic Valley as the site for its newest processing plant. Due to strong collaboration between the company and Idaho officials, Chobani opened the world's largest and most tech-advanced yogurt plant in the world. Most notably, the plant was built and running in just 326 days. When we say Idaho moves at the speed of business, we mean it. Chobani's direct and indirect employment in Twin Falls is over 7,000 people, including several hundred refugees, which is important to the company's ethos and to the community. Chobani's CEO, Hamdi Ulukaya, called South Central Idaho the Silicon Valley of food. And to show how much they believe in the promise of Idaho, they've already announced a major expansion of this facility. In Idaho, our governor calls what's happening in this area the Magic Valley Miracle. More than a century ago, pioneers like my grandparents came to the Magic Valley and saw opportunity in this arid landscape rather than obstacles. Idaho's pioneers harnessed irrigation and made the desert bloom, thus giving the area its name, the Magic Valley. A century later, the Magic Valley is expanding this pioneering vision. Chobani, though, is not the end of the story. You'll see here the other companies who have seen the promise of Idaho. Look at Go-Go Squeeze, Amy's Kitchen, Cliff Bar, Kavanagh Simplot, and Dow. It's also about keeping and growing the companies we already have, like Glanbia, Albertsons, McCain, AgriBeef, and Monsanto. So how is Idaho doing this? Well, part of this is the Team Idaho approach I spoke of, but there are other factors at play as well. Idaho is using a host of tools to incentivize development here. We have comprehensive regulatory coordination. We have a bevy of tax incentives like reimbursements and property tax exemptions. We also utilize infrastructure grants. And we don't forget about workforce training. Food processors need trained technical employees, so communities and schools always jump to the ready. But why am I telling you this? This presentation really isn't an advertisement for Idaho, even though it might seem like it is. I say all of this to you to tell you that political leadership matters. If you want to see growth in production or manufacturing, you have to have leadership. Idaho's business environment didn't just happen. We are a great place to do business because every layer of government sees the importance and acts on it. We're blessed in Idaho, but we aren't without our challenges too. Labor remains one of our chief concerns. Foreign-born labor provides 90% of on-dairy jobs in Idaho. This is not just a political issue. To our industries like dairy, this is a business issue and a moral issue. Consider this: the foreign-born men and women who work on our dairies work alongside our families because every one of our 500+ dairies is family-owned. Looking at some other factors, the dairy industry cannot utilize the current H-2A program, nor do many sectors have a prescribed visa program. Idaho and the nation's ag industry needs fiscally and morally responsible immigration reform. Let's look at another issue giving us pause: trade. Idaho is an export-dependent state. 20% of our commodities are exported. To look at that another way, I guess the Idaho way, would be to say 1 in 6 rows of potatoes is planted for export, and 50% of our grain is exported. Our exporters aren't all mega businesses either. More than 88% of our ag exporters are small businesses. Trade is another area where the Team Idaho approach can assist our industry. Every year, the Department of Agriculture and Commerce join our governor and lieutenant governor on trade missions to carefully chosen international markets. I've had the privilege of participating in more than 20 of these missions. These efforts create the critical mass needed to incentivize new business interests, and state officials bring expertise and access to high-level meetings. I feel like this is another area where we are leveraging leadership really effectively. And it's one reason Idaho's ag exports have nearly doubled since 2007. So naturally, agriculture is deeply concerned about the fate of NAFTA. NAFTA partners have been Idaho's biggest export markets for more than a decade. Since NAFTA, Idaho exports to Canada grew almost 290% and almost 1,000% to Mexico. NAFTA partners account for nearly half of Idaho ag exports. Certainly there are aspects of NAFTA that could be modernized, but negotiations must not negatively impact agriculture. In the absence of NAFTA, Idaho could see a jump in tariffs for cheese of 45% and 20% for French fries. We cannot compete with those tariffs, and we cannot afford to lose ground with our two biggest trade partners. And of course, there are the perennial challenges. Farming is still inherently risky. In the West, we think of wildfires, weather, and water, but we know there are risks in every corner of agriculture, and everyone in this room can appreciate concerns about commodity prices. I don't need to go any further in that subject. And then there's the Farm Bill, which can be a concern, but it's also a huge opportunity. And perhaps our greatest challenge, as has been stated earlier, is the public's perception or general lack of what we do and who we are in agriculture. And like everyone in the industry, we are also concerned about the next generation of people who will make agriculture their way of life. The average age of farmers continues to climb. In Idaho, it's about 57, and so that's the one area that I can claim that I'm well above average. Farming is also tough. The hours are long, the work is arduous, and sometimes the pay is pretty lackluster too. It's not exactly what you would want to put on a help wanted poster. But still, there is a significant opportunity here because farming isn't an occupation. It becomes part of your identity, and it's a calling for many. Now, I have to admit this next picture is a personal one for me. No grandmother worth her salt wouldn't be able to weave in a picture of a grandchild. So here you see our son JD and our granddaughter Maddie. We're very proud of our son and his family. He and his wife are both Marines, who between them have served several missions overseas. But I wasn't always sure they would come back to the ranch. Thankfully, the ag calling that speaks to so many of us resonated with our son and his wife. So now, much to my delight, the fourth and fifth generations of Goulds have returned home to write their own story, farming and ranching. I'm getting ready to wrap up here, but I wanted to end with the most important part of this presentation. There is something much more compelling and important than just the numbers. It's the people. It's the fifth generation rancher and the millennial who makes wine, and the potato grower who maintains one of Idaho's best known legacies. If you really want to know why Chobani chose Idaho, it was because a group of Idaho dairymen sat down with site selectors when the company was looking for their next home. Our dairymen were clear. They said, "We can do it, have faith in us, we're ready to sign contracts today." Government has a part to play. We have to engender a good business environment, but at the end of the day, it's not about us. It's about the producers. It's about the families who have made agriculture their chosen way of life. And it's about the men and women, some of whom are born here, and some who aren't, that help keep our operations running. And in the process, they become part of our families. In this very last slide, I want to say thank you. It also gave me an opportunity to sneak in one more personal picture. This time of Secretaries Perdue and Zinke with me and Governor Otter on my beloved Boise State's blue turf. But there's a more important reason to show you this slide. I included a picture of government officials standing together like a team, because I have every hope that we can act like one. For years, we've been grateful to enjoy really good working relationships with USDA agencies like APHIS, FSA, NASS, and the Foreign Ag Service, but that isn't always the case with federal agencies, especially for a western state like Idaho. I told you political leadership made a difference to Idaho's ability to grow our state. That kind of vision is needed at all levels of government. When I met Secretary Perdue, I saw someone who knew the value of getting back to the grassroots of production. We are so hopeful about his vision for USDA with his focus on job creation, bountiful food, and customer service. And he's brought in a great team of people from all over the country to help implement this mission. In Idaho, government is still accessible and responsive. Now we have greater comfort that our federal partners have that same outlook, and we look forward to a new approach, something that looks a lot like team agriculture. Thank you, and I would be happy to stand for questions. I know we're all coming back up, and I'm putting my questions picture up, Warren, because I know it's the cutest of anybody's.
All right, thank you, Celia. All right, why don't I, Jim, Joe,